Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
Thanks, Brad. As a business and healthcare law firm, we represent clients in multiple business sectors, especially healthcare. This season, we are diving deep into the exhilarating and terrifying process of opening a business. Our theme this season is starting a business.
Yeah, and Michael, starting a business can sound terrifying to some people, but that's just really one season of a business. What are some of the other seasons?
Yeah, this journey, this actual whole year is going to go through 4 different podcast seasons covering these 4 seasons. We have the building season, which is kind of getting the infrastructure in place, the starting a business that we're talking about now. We have the operating season where you're up and going, and what are the different crises that you're managing during that stage. And then the scaling season, what happens when you're trying to grow your business. And then the buying and selling season, the whole set of things that comes up when you're at that point of either acquiring another business or selling your own.
Yeah, and today's guest, Michael, is another OG who really played a big part on helping us start ByrdAdatto.
Yeah, and I'm super excited. Our guest will cover an important need that people need to look at when they're starting a business. But before we bring him on, Brad, we got a little something to talk about.
Uh-oh.
I'm excited because our world champion Texas Rangers are a month away from their title defense. I've been thinking about the awesome nickname for one of our star players, Adolis Garcia.
El Bombe.
Yes, Brad, you got it. It seems like such a great nickname for a Cuban player known for hitting monster home runs.
Yeah, I agree. It's perfect. I mean, he hits these massive bombs, and he does so with this dramatic moments during the season. He's also known for having huge personality, and then some creative celebrations, let's call it, at the home when he does hit a home run.
The hilarious thing is that he's had this nickname since he was a little boy in Cuba.
Was he hitting big home runs back in Cuba T-ball time?
No, Brad, that's not it. Boys in his neighborhood started calling him this because his head looks like a light bulb.
Well, based on my 5 minutes of Spanish I took today with Duolingo, El Bombe means light bulb in Spanish, Michael.
Yes, Brad, it does. And it does remind me just how brutal guys are to each other. Nicknames are often, in some ways, making fun of them, and whether it's a body part or otherwise, which makes me wonder, Brad, have you had any nicknames growing up?
Are you counting Brett as a nickname right now?
Of course not, Brad. Brett is only a recurring character in some of our stories who has an inferiority issue with his counterpart, Miguel. I never said that you are Brett, though I do see how you could draw that conclusion.
Yeah, it appears that Brett needs to stop making fun of this Miguel character as maybe he's getting too sensitive. But I did have many nicknames between high school, college, and even in law school. However, the one that I've had the longest from high school, I was known as Da Butcha. And the reason why was my freshman year playing high school football, I was 5 foot, maybe 100 pounds soaking wet. And I shared my locker next to me was the All-State running back who was leading the state in rushing. And we bumped into each other one day when we were getting ready to go outside. And I kind of bowed up to him, which was kind of a joke. And our backup quarterback ran over and his name was Chris, pushed Chris back, goes, "Watch out, Chris. The butcher is going to take your lunch money." And the entire locker room laughed hysterically. And then from then on, I became known as Da Butcher. And for those who don't know, I am still not very tall.
Well, I'm just relieved that it's not like some sort of true crime nickname.
No,
not a serial killer.
Not a serial killer.
Okay.
But what about you?
Well, with the last name Byrd, I've had too many nicknames to count over the years. I practically forgot that my name was Michael by the time I got into the workforce. The most common name I've been called is Bird, or some variation like Bird Dog, Bird Man, or Birdie.
Yeah. And I know the one nickname you really, really love, and audience members, I mean hate, is when someone calls you Mike. Yeah. Well, any less common and more embarrassing nicknames?
Yeah, let's stay away from Mike. My roommate in college, Guy, had multiple nicknames for every person he meets. They're all affectionate, so I would not say they're embarrassing. His main nickname for me is Doc, and he calls my wife Slim Shady.
Okay. Is this because you're claimed to be practically a doctor?
Fair question. My dad is a doctor, and so that does almost make me a doctor.
Almost,
but
right.
It actually, his nickname has no ties to anything. He just started calling me Doc. And Stephanie actually does not have any ties to Eminem, other than, this was like Eminem's prime back when he gave her that nickname.
Gotcha.
The only embarrassing nickname is that my nieces from my sister Meredith call me Uncle Donkey. And
really?
Yes. Yeah, it stemmed from a movie reference from Shrek. I called my son Aiden Donkey in front of them, and they all decided to reverse it and have, for the past 20 years, been calling me Uncle Donkey.
Okay, Doc Donkey. What does this have to do with our nice guest who's waiting to join us?
Nothing other than I've known him long enough to know his nickname, but I'll let him tell you that here shortly. Joining us today for the first time is our friend Matt Burns. He is the Senior Vice President for Willis Towers Watson in Austin, Texas. Prior to that, he was the Senior Vice President for Stevens Insurance. He has been a commercial insurance broker for more than 20 years. He graduated from Baylor in 1995 and has, like I said, been a longtime friend and helped us get us up and going with our insurance needs several years ago. Matt, welcome.
Hey, great to be here with you guys. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Well, I guess we got to jump right in there, Matt. What is, if you could share, what is the nickname that Mr. Byrd was referencing to earlier?
It's really easy. It's I don't know many people that don't call me Burnsy. That's kind of stuck. It's always been a part of the equation. So,
well, that is it. Yes. Yeah. Well, cool. Well, we're so glad you're here, and like to kick things off and get a little bit of introduction about you professionally. Tell us about Willis and your clientele. Just kind of introduce what you do.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And thanks again, guys, seriously, for having me on. I've been in insurance for actually coming up on 30 years. It's hard to believe that. At Willis, it doesn't seem like, some days it seems like it's been a long time, and other days it seems like it's been since yesterday. My expertise is on the property and casualty side. I'm focused on corporate insurance. So from startups to all the way to Fortune 500 companies, and anything and everything in between. And so the focus really for me in my practice is really more education than it is product sales. I try to stay very, very, very far away from that aspect of things. And what I love about your firm that complements our mentality and our goals is just making sure that we're complementing where a business is in its life cycle. So I love what you guys are doing, and it fits really well with our practice for sure.
Awesome. Well, and that's a perfect segue back to, this season, Matt, where we're focusing on starting a business. And from an insurance perspective, we'd love to have you share some thoughts. But when one of your clients says to you, "Hey, I'm thinking about Matt starting a business," what is really the first question you're going to ask them?
Yeah, I think the first thing, especially these days, I think the first thing is, what's your funding? Do you have a capital partner or funding source? I mean, that in conjunction, that question, along with a real clear, high-level understanding of what the business does, what they're involved with, what industry sector, and what variations of that are they focused on. Those two things will have a lot to do with where you take the insurance placement and how you build it out. And unfortunately, it's not asked very often. They're relegated to an SIC code, or you just don't dive quite deep enough to figure out how to build that out. Does that make sense?
Yeah. How does that help you knowing kind of where they're, getting that answer of their funding strategy?
Well, a lot of times, if they're for example, if they're private equity backed, and they've let's say that they've given up the majority ownership in that scenario, there's a broader way to establish coverage and program at the capital partner level. But by and large, you'll have folks that'll give up 15, 20, 25% equity in their firm in exchange for a capital partner. In that case, in either case, those capital partners are going to have certain requirements and certain needs or requests for specific types of coverage that you wouldn't see if it was ground up, self-funded, and you had the money already, right? So that's the first thing. And then as you establish from an industry point of view, that can play a role too. So not to get ahead of us.
No. Yeah, totally. And I think in a moment, I want to ask something first, but I want to get into the types of insurance you think about for business. But I guess kind of before we get there, let's touch a little bit about the timing, and a new business owner is thinking a lot of things on their checklist of things they need to do to get their business up and going. When do you think they should be thinking about acquiring insurance?
Man, great question. And it's probably one of the bigger questions out there that I'll see people rush to get things put in place too early.
Okay.
So let me give you a little bit of a real example, kind of roadmap. So as you start something, you don't really have any liability if you're not selling anything, whether that's a service, a product. As a general rule, I would say, while you need to be prepared from a budgetary perspective, and we can help with that, as can a lot of different brokers, but budgetary perspective, getting an idea of cost based on projections, I would say to any startup, don't worry about year 3, year 2, worry about year 1. And it's important to focus on how much do you know you're going to hit versus how much you hope to hit, right? In the way of revenue, that's going to have a big bearing on how insurance is structured. But more importantly, the timeline, don't put it in place before you're actually performing the services or selling the product or doing what you are intending to do. And sometimes when a business is started, it may be months before that happens. I would tell you that the most basic trigger for starting just a business owner's policy is if you've got a lease on space, and the landlord's going to require you to carry certain elements of cover that are basic, right? It pays to put that in place first for that reason. Wait for some of the other more complex lines of cover until you start actually selling whatever it is, service, support, product that you're going to be servicing or supporting or selling.
That makes sense. I mean, first off, it's great advice because, especially when someone's starting a business, from a cash flow perspective, you're helping them realize that they will need insurance, but let's hold off until you actually need it, which really I think, and you kind of started a little bit talking about this now, but I think for our audience members, really start talking about the type of insurance that, it doesn't matter what type of line of business, some of the basic stuff that you should consider when you're starting your business. Let's say, to your point, you're now operational. What are the things should they be considering? So
a couple things to start with that are non-insurance related, but we rely very heavily on it is folks like ByrdAdatto, firms like ByrdAdatto. Where I really feel like most insurance transactions miss is we have to be able to look at indemnity agreements between you and your client base. The requirements are one thing, right? That's you're going to have contractual requirements to carry certain aspects of insurance. But as you guys know better than me, it all comes down to the language in that contract as to how a claim could potentially be defined, right? So that's the first place to start. And for us, we're not drafting legal opinions, but I want to put a client in a position where they can understand we've got to craft product and build that product specific to their need based on those points within their MSA or within a contract that they're required or obligated to. That being said, you start with the most basic, which is what I talked about earlier, a business owner's policy or general liability and property policy that are packaged together. That meets the criteria of your lease. That slip and fall cover, it doesn't cost a whole lot of money at all to do those things, depending on the industry sector. But for a startup, typically, regardless of industry, doesn't cost a whole lot of money. Then we start getting kind of moving through things like malpractice, if you're a clinic or a physician's group, any kind of professional liability, if you're a lawyer or if you're an insurance broker. That's important to be very specific about what you're doing, where you're going with it, and what type of business interaction you're having with your client base. And then we get into other aspects of cover like cyber liability, employment practices liability, directors and officers of board liability cover, depending on the nature of where the company is in the moment and what their requirements would look like from a contractual point of view.
Awesome.
There's a lot there, and I want to make sure I'm covering what you guys.
No, I'd like to unpack a couple of these.
Yeah.
Just we're going to have our audience, is anywhere from an entrepreneur thinking about starting up to, private equity folks that are doing more sophisticated transactions, and I'd like to kind of start unpack it a little bit from the ground up. So just generally, you're talking about a general liability policy. Talk a little bit, just generally, what do those policies typically cover?
Yeah. So, and to reinforce, that's the most basic entry point policy from a business perspective that you have to have. Typically, the uninsurance related answer is to meet the criteria of a lease agreement.
Right.
You got to have it in order to inhabit the space you're in. Now, depending on the nature of the company, that policy is going to cover you for third parties that take action against you for property damage or bodily injury. So you can imagine the difference between, just to make the point, the difference between, let's say, a law office and the traffic in a law office versus a neighborhood grocery store.
Oh, yeah.
If you think about those different, they're going to be looked at differently from a rating perspective. And
Right.
One's going to have more severity than the other as far as the potential for claim, but they're both the same type of policies, very basic.
Gotcha. And I'm gonna gloss over malpractice, not because it's not important, but I think it's intuitive to most of our audience that this is going to cover, professional negligence for whatever service you're providing. I would love to hear your perspective on employment liability and cybersecurity, because it feels like we get a lot of questions about this over the last several years in particular.
No, and amen. I mean, I would tell you that from our practice's perspective, it's those two claims are things we see, I would venture to say, weekly. It's just all the time. So
Yeah.
I understand. Let me start. I'm going to divide them both kind of independent of one another.
Okay.
Because there are some things to really consider with both. Let's start with when I say easier, I mean easier to get, easier to obtain, which is the employment practices liability policy. Typically, and it is somewhat of an oxymoron. There's so many in insurance, I realize, but if you buy employment practices liability and it's attached to a directors and officers liability policy, so that's your board, your officers, your executives, blah, blah, blah. If you buy that policy, you can actually attach employment practices liability to it. And many times that will drive cost down further, which is, therein lies the oxymoron. It just doesn't make sense, but that's typically what you'll see. You can also buy it on a standalone basis. Now, the big thing with employment practices that you have to really focus on if you're a consumer or client or a small business is, what's your turnover ratio look like? If you've got a high turnover percentage, and I would suggest that if the turnover is more than 40%, less than 40%, you're you're pretty okay. If it's over that, it's not that you're not okay, but they're going to scrutinize things a lot more closely from an underwriting perspective based on that, right? Because the direct connection between a claim and turnover is there.
Right.
So you have a higher probability of claim if you've got a higher turnover rate. I would tell you that from a private startup, private company perspective, the biggest reason people will take employment practices liability is for the defense cover. So they're not taking it anticipating this is the practical answer, but they're not doing it anticipating some big settlement or judgment or front page paper scenario. Although that could happen, the majority of the time they're doing it because they want the ability to access legal defense and get them through to settlement as fast as possible. And then on the other hand, you do have legitimate situations in which any kind of hostile work environment scenario can happen, and you want that kind of cover in order to fund that event in case you do get served.
Right.
For wrongful termination or discrimination or libel, slander, defamation, sexual harassment, things like that.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of a lightning rod situation these days in general, where you see legitimate claims, but you also see claims that aren't so legitimate, or appear not to be.
Right. So, and I know Michael mentioned cybersecurity. I know just 10 years ago, probably very few people had cybersecurity. Have you seen an increase in people understanding the need for it and actually understanding why they need to get it from you?
Yeah, that's a great point. And you're right. There was a huge influx of purchasing, and I would say massive amounts of cyber liability coverage was taken up. And then in about 2020, 2019, we started to see the market, and we're still here, but we're starting to see the insurance market tighten up. And if anybody is awake these days, they hear almost weekly, daily, whatever, of a breach that has occurred. Whether it's a big box retailer or bank or whatever the case may be. And so you still have access to cyber liability, but the underwriters are much, much more fickle and particular about detail. How you're protecting your data is going to be a critical piece to gaining access to cyber liability cover. What your protocols are to prevent a breach from occurring. Carriers are a lot more involved in the loss control and mitigation of those types of scenarios. And then the market has also shrunk from the standpoint of, let's say 5 years ago, Brad, there was probably 20 carriers in the market domestically that were offering cyber liability for small businesses. And now there may be 3 or 4.
Wow.
So it's a difficult market. It's a difficult thing to grasp and to gain access to, but it can be done.
Is it hard are there a lot of hoops to get to the underwriting process for cybersecurity? In other words, does a small business need to have their IT ducks in a row to be able to apply?
Yeah, and I would tell you this, I don't want to pigeonhole any small business into these categories, but if you're fintech, if you're in the banking industry, or if you're dealing, if you're a hospital, for example, and you're dealing with a lot of personal identifiable information, you're controlling that, then there's a lot of scrutiny. But to answer the question directly, I think you need to be prepared to have your IT ducks in a row, but you also need to be prepared. Kind of go back to ByrdAdatto. It's really relying on firms like ByrdAdatto that can review and evaluate third-party agreements that your startup companies may have with an IT provider of some sort. The more you can push that liability, that cyber risk away from your own company, the better off you're going to be. And it does reflect in the cyber liability policies that are attainable. When you can show them that that's the measure you've taken, carriers realize, my goodness, I mean, we've defrayed, so to speak, our risk because of what they're doing from a contractual point of view and otherwise, and that will help. That's a must, I would say, at this point in the game.
Awesome. And then kind of a final question before we wrap up, just quick thoughts. I mean, you've mentioned that general liability is going to be required typically with your lease. I think malpractice is typically going to be required as part of your license for whatever type of license you have. Are there any other insurance types that tend to be a must versus a may when someone's considering starting a business?
I really can't think of anything other than the best advice I could give there always is you got to have a broker and an attorney that are communicating with each other to review both upstream and downstream contracts.
Right.
Because what we're seeing, especially in the startup world, is just it's a moving target. I mean, we're seeing it change. It seems like monthly, where people are requiring more and more and more product to be purchased. So I would start there first. Amazing.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I just looked up. We're out of time. Matt, I'm so grateful to have you on. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, man. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. What we'll do next is we'll go into commercial, and on the other side, Brad and I will wrap up with a few legal insights. Thank you.
Thanks.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise. Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd. Now, Michael, this season, our theme is starting a business. And we're really, camping out on this building season right now. And, we just had Matt on, and he had a lot of really interesting takes about insurance in general. But I thought he raised a couple of great points about when you are starting a business, things to consider. And maybe, of course, Matt, if you have a broker like Matt, you would hopefully know this, but a lot of people don't realize when they do enter these contracts with a landlord or with a employee or employment opportunities, there's going to be certain language inside that contract that requires you to carry a certain type of insurance and or a certain level of insurance. So not just you have to have coverage for slips and falls, but you have to have at this level of coverage, or not only the fact that you have to have malpractice, but at this level of insurance. That's an important element to understanding those requirements that are built into it, but that's just a piece of the aspects. There's also can be buried in there indemnifications, which he did kind of mention a little bit. Maybe you can jump in on there.
Sure, yeah, and I'd just add too, the more sophisticated your startup is, the more places you have to look for insurance requirements.
Yeah.
So as you're raising capital, et cetera, the stakes can go up on the types of policies. And the indemnification question that you just mentioned goes up. So indemnification is a super boring topic, even to lawyers.
Yes.
And so I've got to try to get in and get out since you gave me that question.
You're welcome.
Yes. So audience, the best way I can describe indemnification is think of it as insurance, but between two people instead of an insurance company.
Yep.
And so if I'm indemnifying Brett for something, I'm basically saying in these circumstances, I will pay if something happens. And so this becomes important because when you have indemnification, there's this coverage that two people give each other, and that can impact your policy that you have written. That's why you have to have a broker, because if you don't have certain language, like maybe that say to the extent not covered by insurance, you indemnify, where you make it clear that you want the insurance to cover things first before you get down to this private indemnification, or otherwise you could actually block yourself out of eligibility for insurance proceeds.
Right. Well, Michael, unfortunately, that is all the time we have today, but do not panic, audience. We will be back next Wednesday when Chris Williams comes and joins us to talk all about helping you start your business and understand the important elements of commercial banking. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe, make sure to give us a 5-star rating, and share with your friends.
You can can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.